Count me down. All right, we're going to do Megiddo. And as you know, Megiddo is one of those places not mentioned, but about a dozen times, maybe 13 times in the Bible, but it dominates Protestant evangelical theology in end times theology and studies. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. We're going to start with some biblical notes. Does everybody have an outline, or who cares to have an outline, have one? Let's start with the biblical notes. The city of Megiddo is first mentioned among the cities and the kings which Joshua captured during his conquest of the Promised Land in Joshua chapter 12 verse 21. It's part of the land that was taken. You'll know that Moses has died. They've come out of the Exodus from Egypt down here to the south. They've been in the Sinai Peninsula for 40 years. They come up. They have the problem with the Moabite women. They get past that, and the people of Israel move up to the east side of the Jordan River, Sea of Galilee, Jordan River, the Dead Sea, the Mediterranean, and the land. They come up on the west side, they cut across, and then they go south, and they go up. And Megiddo is one of the cities that was conquered during the conquest of the Promised Land by Joshua, Joshua chapter 12. Megiddo was allotted to Manasseh in the allotment of the land. You'll remember that the 12 tribes moved in. After the land is taken, they begin to allot portions of the land to each of the tribe and allow the tribes to settle into the land. Megiddo is listed in Solomon's 5th administrative district as a fortified city. There's about a dozen administrative districts that Solomon put together. Solomon was a genius, as you know, probably the second most intelligent man after Jesus who ever lived. And he put together administrative districts in order to organize and to administrate the ever-expanding Israel that he was governing. During the time of Solomon, Israel gets about as big as it's ever going to get. And Hatzor and Gezer were also cities, along with Megiddo, that were fortified, which meant that they were going to have chariots and horses. And we could spend a lot of time talking about the problem of the chariots and the horses and all of the wives that Solomon had. But here is a picture of the way that the districts were put together. You'll notice, obviously Judah's down there in the south. If you go to the very center of that picture, you'll see 5. That's the 5th district. It's west of the Jordan River. If you go to the 11 o'clock position of that district, you see where Megiddo is located. And you'll remember that we talked about Caesarea Maritima last week, that as you're coming down the Mediterranean coast, there's that little hump. And then just to the south of it is Caesarea Maritima. If you go straight across, you go to the Sea of Galilee. You have the Kishon River, which will be a part of our study. You'll see Mount Carmel and Mount Tabor, which are all in sight of Megiddo, and it kind of gives you a reference point for where the city is located. And you'll also see that Hatzor, if you go 12 o'clock straight up north from the Sea of Galilee, Hatzor is one of those other cities that were fortified. And if you go even further up to the north, you go to Dan, and that's about the extent that Israel under Solomon got to. Dan is a very interesting place. I don't know if we'll have an opportunity to see it, but Dan is one of those places where you go and you're not expecting much, because Dan, just somebody tell me a story about Dan. There's not much that happens there, but it's a very important city. When you go there, you are given some perspectives. One is the size of the altars that were used for the sacrifices of bulls, oxen, these kinds of things. Enormous pieces of religious equipment for the Hebrews. Gigantic. On the other hand, when you go to Dan, you'll walk to the place where the sacrifices were, and there's this aluminum skeleton of an altar place with the horns and all of that. It is enormous. You turn around, and Dan was one of the places where there was the calf worship, and you turn around, and there are some steps, and up at the top of the steps is a replica of the golden calf that was there, or the calf that was worshipped there. I always thought, calf was probably pretty big. Golden calf was probably large. Not about that big. And you've got this gigantic altar, which you never thought it was going to be that big. But when you think about it, it makes sense. Cows, oxen, it makes sense. But then you turn around, and the other perspective is just how small the idol of the calf, associated with the idols of the Canaanite idols, how small it really was compared to the way we would think that it's huge. But the city of Hatzor was one of those that was fortified along with Megiddo. Biblical notes. Megiddo is a place where Ahaziah, actually I've skipped a page here, I think. Megiddo is a place where Ahaziah died after being wounded in battle with Jehu. This is during the divided kingdom. I don't know why it says Jehy. Like that's an autocorrect for Jehu. Which one looks better? That doesn't make sense to me. But it's supposed to say Jehu. And you know that in the divided kingdom, they were at war with each other a lot. In 2 Kings, Ahaziah of Judah is wounded in battle by Jehu. He makes it to Megiddo. And in 2 Kings chapter 9, that is the place where he dies. It's also the place where Josiah, and this is one of the sad pieces of history with Megiddo. Josiah dies after being wounded in an attempt to keep Pharaoh Necho from going further north to go to the aid of the Assyrian army. And in 2 Kings chapter 23, 2 Chronicles chapter 35, you have that story where Josiah, who is one of the great beloved godly kings of all time in Israel, he is told by Pharaoh Necho, don't come and fight me. He decides he's going to do it anyway, disguises himself. He's wounded in battle, makes it to Megiddo. The chronicler in 2 Chronicles chapter 35 said he was so beloved that even to the day in which 2 Chronicles is being written, there are laments that are being said about Josiah. And again, it's one of the sad things that takes place at Megiddo. Megiddo is mentioned in the New Testament book of Revelation as the place where the kings meet. Armageddon, Revelation chapter 16 and 16. One of the real issues in understanding Revelation is understanding what kind of literature it is. Nobody wants to, you're not supposed to read a love letter like an insurance policy, right? And you're not supposed to read a how-to book like a romance novel. I mean, everything has a way that it is to be read and to be understood. The Torah is a theological book on the history and how things came to be. The letters of Paul are personal letters that he's writing to churches or to individuals. They're like letters that we would get or emails that we would get today. The Gospels are not chronological histories of the life of Jesus. The gospel, the word gospel in its original language means good news. It's just telling the news, but telling the news in such a way that it creates faith. So it's not quite just telling pure news like the radio stations might or the newspaper might. And it's not just exactly like a sermon, but it's got sermons in it, but it's a special kind of literature to create faith, the Gospel of John says, in the Messiah. You've got historical books, and Revelation has its own kind of genre as well. It's known as apocalyptic. And apocalyptic language or literature was literature that developed between about 200 BC and about 250 AD. And it was written to people who were under duress. They were in danger of not just being persecuted, but really being oppressed and conquered and maybe even destroyed. And the language is very symbolic. I mean, if I'm writing a message to you and I'm trying to encourage you, but we're both facing the same kind of enemy, I'm not going to use very literal, direct language, making all of these, one-to-one associations, because what if it falls into the wrong hands, then everybody's in trouble. So the language was written in a symbolic way. It was written in a very picturesque way. Instead of being very detailed, it's broad strokes. And in Revelation chapter 16, you've got these 7 bowls of wrath. When you get to the 6th bowl, it is poured out, and part of this is the gathering of these 4 kings at a place called Armageddon. It's kind of an anglicized way of saying Hamar Megiddo, which means the mount or the hill of Megiddo, which is what Megiddo is. It's up on top of a hill. and it overlooks this plain. But what is significant about it is that this is the place, when you look at Megiddo, it is one of the most strategic places in the entire Middle East. We'll talk about, and I'll show you kind of a three-dimensional map of why it was so strategic and such an important place, and why it was such a violent area of the Middle East. It was because it controlled the Via Maris, the way to the seas, a trade route. But in Revelation, they are reading this as the place where the battles of God are taking place and where God's people are victorious and God's judgments are being made. And so it would be like saying, you know, Wayne and I are having a tussle, but Wayne says Mark's going to meet his Waterloo. Now, everybody here would know we're not going to France and we're not going to fight with muskets, but Waterloo is a very famous place where Napoleon was defeated by the British Army. It's very famous. And when we say that, we mean that guy's, I'm going to be defeated by Wayne, which would never happen, by the way. And you know this to be. But everybody knows that it's not literal. But the message is there. The message is there. And that's what's happening in Revelation chapter 16. It's not a literal battle. It is a symbolic battle, a symbolic message that God's people are not going to lose to Rome, that God is going to defeat Rome. Rome is going to have a shelf life, and the kingdom of God is going to be eternal, and God never loses anybody that belong to Him. And that's the point of Revelation chapter 16 and Armageddon. Some historical notes. Megiddo is a very ancient city. It goes all the way back to the Bronze Age. It's about 5,000 years ago, where it was a Canaanite city-state. Megiddo has, up to this point, there are about 26 layers of ruins, which indicate that, man, people have been living in this area for a very, very long time. James Johnson was showing me, he and Michelle and kids went to the coast this last week, and he was showing me video of the wind blowing the sand across the beach. And as we're sitting there watching it, we're seeing dunes form against his feet. We're seeing, everything is just changing. You do the same thing in this part of the world over thousands and thousands of years with wind blowing and armies coming through and things being built on top of each other. What you find is that there is a lot of stuff buried underground. And a lot of it is just natural causes, like the wind and sand and storms and floods and mud and erosion and all of the things that you find in nature that will cover up these ancient sites, especially if they've been abandoned and nobody is there cultivating them or taking care of them. And when you go to Megiddo today, what you're standing on is standing on like 26 layers of life and civilization and technology of the age. And for there to be 26 layers means it's been there for a very, very long time. Gottlieb Schumacher of the German Society for the Study of Palestine, he made the first excavations beginning in 1903. It went to about 1905. War breaks out in Europe. Things are getting really dicey. He goes back to Germany. All of the stuff that he discovered. Now, he was not the technology for doing archaeology today is the difference between how they discovered oil, in the late 19th century and the way that they frack today. I mean, the technologies are just not even in the same galaxy. And so what Schumacher did was basically they thought they had found something. It was just a hill. And they were pretty sure that was probably the area where Solomon City and Ahab City, Megiddo, was located. So they just dug a big trench across it and started going down. It really wasn't the most practical way to do it, even though they had to start somewhere, and that was really what the technology of the day said to do. But their understanding of pottery was in the Dark Ages compared to what we know about pottery today as it's found in these different layers. But the sad thing, though, is that he was there before anybody else was. And all of the stuff that he discovered, his drawings, his notes, all of that, but a very tiny portion was destroyed in World War I and was later published, but by that point it was really not of much use to us. And then in 1925 a second excavation began, and from 1925 until about 1939 it went, and it was with the Oriental Institute, which is out of the University of Chicago, and that's when they really began to dig up some stuff, which we'll see here in just a minute. And they begin to see that, yes, this is an incredibly significant site in helping us to understand the Bible. Then the great Yigal Yadin, probably the greatest archaeologist of the 20th century, the greatest of our generation. He is the guy that put Masada on the map. Is a very, very incredible, intuitive archaeologist. He began in 1960. 66, 67, 70, and 71, 3 different forays into the site, and he began to make sense of a lot of what had been found before him and what he was finding with the technology of the day. And then the most recent is 1994, and some is still going on. The University of Tel Aviv has undertaken some of the most recent excavations, and it's in this excavation time with the folk, the archaeologists from Tel Aviv, that they, at one time, that they thought there was a southern and a northern stable for Solomon's chariots and for his horses. Since the Tel Aviv people have gone in, this has fallen out of favor. They believe that this wasn't even around during the time of Solomon, that this was the stables that you read about in Solomon's lifetime next to his palace, that this was probably not around for another century and a half during the time of Ahab, and that they were probably storage units. Isn't it kind of amazing that you had storage units in the ancient world? Yeah, people had to store stuff. The archaeological notes. First, the Northern Gate. I'm going to show you a model. Wherever you go in Israel, in fact, one of the really cool things, right, is the models, how they try to replicate what it looked like during the time of Jesus or in its heyday. There's one at Megiddo. There's you get to see the entire city of Jerusalem during the time of Jesus. There's one at Masada, and they really kind of give you perspective, right? And so these gates right here have been discovered. They're on the north side of the site. Megiddo is about 35 acres. It rises 200 feet up in the air, and there's a very steep ramp that goes to a series of gates that goes into the city, which is surrounded by casement walls. That gate has been discovered. It's a really cool thing to see when you get there. There are several Canaanite temple sites, going all the way back to the Bronze Age, which would have been, as far back as 3000 BC. You have, this is a Canaanite city-state. People of Canaan, this was an important city. It was sort of a city and a nation unto itself there in the northern part of Israel. There's a granary, which I think is one of the most fascinating things there, because we know the story of Joseph and the 7 years of plenty and the 7 years of want, and the dreams that he had in Egypt and all of that. And having grown up around grain elevators with my dad in the grain inspection business, we've just seen the way that wheat and barley in these different grains were stored in these elevators, and how you have to manage the dust because it becomes very explosive and can blow up. I remember my dad telling my brother and I, don't get near those elevators. Those things, they're dangerous. They can blow up, and scared us to death. And then you go, and here in the ancient world, you have this gigantic granary with the steps that are going down it, and it looks like this gigantic pit that's lined with stone. And you think, how did they manage the dust? What was it covered with to protect it from the elements and from the weather? And here is this massive amount of grain that would feed the people inside of this fortress city, up on a hill, for a long, long time, in case they were faced by an enemy and surrounded. We'll see the granary here in a minute. Water tunnel. One of the great things about Israel is that you can still go into a lot of these tunnels. You can go in, if under the Temple Mount, you can go into Hezekiah's tunnel that was supplying water to the city of Israel when they were fussing with Sennacherib and all of them. There's a water tunnel here that is located right here, and it's a big hole in the ground. And you go way down into it, and and when you look at it today, the picture I have to show you, it looks like you're going into Space Mountain. It looks like a Disneyland ride, but you're going underground, and then you're walking underground vertically, horizontally. You go down vertically, you go across horizontally to a spring. And Wayne and Jordan and I, we were actually in some of these tunnels in Israel, in Jerusalem. This is not one I'm feeling like I want to try. I mean, it's just, I'll show you a picture of it here in a minute. But I mean, you got to walk a long way to get to that spring. But when you think about it, I mean, it was the advantage of that spring and having water like that is if you didn't have to go outside your city walls, and you had the gigantic granary that just had food for years in it, and you had a water supply that the enemy could not get to, and you had casement walls that were super high, and there was no way that they were going to be able to knock those things down. And if they did, their casement walls, they knocked one wall down, the wall right behind it is there, and it's frustrating. It's just a second layer of protection. Megiddo was a really, really safe place to be in a very violent part of the world. Not only do you have a water tunnel, but you have the stables, and again, we'll show some pictures of both of these, but these are probably the stables, and there are mangers. They actually have sculptures there. They're not 3D sculptures. They're wrought iron shapes of horses and chariots, and with the horses hooked up to them in this area so that you can get an idea of the perspective. But again, these were probably not even around during Solomon's time. These storage units probably came about during the time of Ahab. And then after the stables, you get to see the casement walls. So geographical notes. Tel Megiddo is 35 acres in size. It rises up 200 feet or 60 meters above ground. It lies in the Carmel range and in sight of Mount Tabor. So going over to this map, okay, Galilee, the Jordan River, the Dead Sea, Jerusalem is here. This is the Mediterranean, and as you look on your map, it has that little hump where Haifa is located. Caesarea Maritima that we looked at last week is a little bit to the south. Between Haifa and Caesarea Maritima is Mount Carmel, the Mount Carmel range. And then you have Mount Tabor, that's the first mountain we saw as we were going to the Sea of Galilee and to the kibbutz here where we were going to stay. And the Via Maris came down, hit Capernaum, and then this is all mountains. I mean, there are mountains everywhere. And so during this period of time, I mean, if you're on the Via Maris, you want to travel, you want it to be safe, and you want it to be level. And so, you don't want to always have to climb through mountain passes. And, if you go, right in here is a place called the Arbel Pass and the Wadi of the Doves, which was the place that Jesus traveled from Nazareth to Capernaum. The Arbel Cliffs, going through that mountain pass was very, very dangerous. The Lestai, which later became the Zealots, were in that area. It was very, very dangerous. So you wanted it to be flat. You wanted it to be, where the travel was easy. And as you were coming down from Capernaum, you would enter the Carmel range, and you would have the kind of the mountains here to the northwest, and you would have an open area. I'll show you a map. It looks like a paw with 3 fingers, and that was to Egypt or wherever you needed to get to do your trade. And so Megiddo was an incredibly important place. If you had Megiddo and you had Capernaum, then you basically controlled the Via Maris trade route in the northern part of Israel. This is why some of this is so bloody and so violent, is because you didn't have to conquer all of this stuff over here. Listen, if you're going to attack Texas and you're going to take over Texas, what do? You get Dallas-Fort Worth, you get Austin, you get Houston, and you don't even care about West Texas, right? If you owned Megiddo and Capernaum, you own the major part of that trade route through Israel. And that's why everybody fought there. They fought here because, first of all, it was flat. I'll show you pictures in just a second. When you're standing on top of Megiddo, you know, you can just see for miles. I mean, you can see the enemy coming. And if your best defense are chariots, you want to be in a place where you can see the enemy for a long way and it's flat, where you can roll those chariots with all those horses in front of the finest horses you can find in the Middle East and the ancient world. And you've got, remember, you're 200 feet up in the air and you got a ramp going down 200 feet. You've got some speed going as you leave on those chariots, and you can see that enemy. You can be prepared for that enemy way in advance. And nobody wants to fight in the mountains. They want to fight on the plains. In the valley of Elah, it's flat. The Philistines had chariots, right? They had iron. They're down on the floor. The Israelites are up in the hills because they have none of that technology, and they are safe because those chariots aren't going to go uphill. It was the perfect place to put an army of chariots, and you could protect your kingdom right there. So that's why it was so important historically. You're in the Carmel range, inside of Mount Carmel. What happened at Mount Carmel, by the way?
Elijah.
What's that?
Elijah.
Yes, Elijah. And the Kishon Brook is right there beside it. And we'll talk about Mount Carmel here in a couple of weeks. But that's the place where Elijah had the contest with the prophets of Asherah and Baal, and they were all killed. They were executed at the end of that down by the Kishon Brook. It overlooks the Jezreel Valley, which is that valley that is very flat. You'll see just how flat and how big it is in a couple of minutes. Strategic location on the Via Maris and the mountain pass. So here's Israel in the north. If you go to the very top of that picture where the yellow line starts to come down, it's going to go all the way down to Dan, which is straight north of the Sea of Galilee. And then it's going to go straight down to the Sea of Galilee and go west at Capernaum. And as you can see, it winds its way through that Jezreel Valley where you see the fingers. And then where that 90-degree bend is, right there, kind of at the, what would that be, the 9 o'clock position, you see that it turns 90 degrees, goes through that mountain pass all the way down to Caesarea Maritima on the coast. You can see that Megiddo was right there at that place where you were crossing the mountains, and if you couldn't get past Megiddo, you could not get over those mountains, and you couldn't get down into the southern part of the country with your army or with whatever political weaponry you had at the time to try to take over the country. Here's the model. This 4 o'clock position is really the north end of Megiddo. You can see the gates, and you can see how the ramp was fashioned as it came down alongside that hill. This is a model, so they're going to show you cutouts. There's another picture where you can see cutouts on the back side of it. They show you, okay, this is the Solomon Megiddo, and we're going to show you what's still underneath it. Remember, 26 layers from here all the way down. Here's another picture of it. You can kind of see on the back side of it. You see the cutout, but you can see where the gates were. You can see what they thought were stables at the time, but are now storage units. You have Solomon's palace there at the 10 o'clock position. At the 11 o'clock position, you have the stables, and on the other side of that, you have that big hole in the ground, which became their water tunnel. Here are the gates on the north side, what's been excavated. And as you can see, those are hefty walls. They're not going to go down easily by any stretch of the imagination. Here's a straight view into the city through those gates. And here's what it looks like from the air. This big hole to the side here, that is that water tunnel. And then if you go just to the left of it, that's the area that are the stables. If you go further left of that, that's where Solomon's palace was. Down here at about the 7 o'clock position is where the gates were located. On the far side, that's where some of those Canaanite temples were found. Let me go back here for just a second. You see the palace with the wall around it and then the gate going inside of those walls? That disc-looking shape in front, that's the granary. So it was not far from Solomon's palace, his quarters there when he was living there. Here's looking to the northeast, and again, you get a picture of the water tunnel at the 6 o'clock position. You get an idea of the stables with the open courtyard. You see the 4 palm trees down there by the hole. That area straight north of that, or straight at the 12 o'clock position, that was the gigantic courtyard where the animals were exercised. If you go back to the right, that's where they recorded the barns and stables. That gray area is where Solomon's palace was located. Here's the granary. As you can see, it's enormous. It is lined with small stones. No telling how long it took them to build this thing, but you can see in this picture the steps that wind around it down to the bottom, and how the steps, there's 2 sets of steps that go down into the bottom for people to be able to gather their grain. Here's the great temple. This temple right here was one of the great finds in Israel of all time. They're guessing there was probably 3 or 4 centers of Canaanite worship, through the years here. This one is the biggest temple that has been found in Israel. The reason being, Solomon and Zerubbabel and Herod the Great's temple was completely destroyed, and they're not really sure. There's a lot of debate even where they were located. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But this gives us an idea of what a Canaanite temple would have looked like, and the size of it, as well as what they've been able to dig up and put back together, is pretty fascinating. That round thing in the center there with the black dot, that is an altar. And then this is the ride into the water. As you can see, you are going down pretty steep underground, only to hit bottom and then cut across for a little ways to get to the spring. And again, to think that they carved this out of rock, is really, really amazing. Just the ingenuity and the engineering that they had, about 3,000 years ago during the time of Solomon. It is really, really amazing. And then here are the mangers in the stable. There is not a whole lot of stuff made out of wood in Israel. One of the things, and I never knew this, but we went to the Nissan brothers where they did all of the olive wood art. You cut off a limb, you're going to carve it up, you let it dry and season a little bit, maybe a couple of months or so. These guys, they have a courtyard off of their main fabrication area for their statues and all the stuff that they make out of olive wood. They have to stack that olive wood out there, and they just pile it up. And did they say it was 7 years? It had to dry 7 years. I mean, the wood that if you buy a camel made out of olive wood in Israel, that had been drying in a pile someplace for a minimum of 7 years before they were able to carve something out of it. And so, olive wood, which is not all over the place, it's more in the south. I mean, it's not the greatest of wood. Palm trees and all that, that'll tear your chainsaw up. There's so much that was made out of rock or cut through rock. And Jesus, as a tectone, was a worker not just with wood, but was with any hard substance, which is what a tectone is. And so he probably not only was a carpenter, but he was also a mason. If you had masonry skills, you always had a job and you always had work in ancient Israel. The problem was, if you did it during the time of Solomon, you were probably a slave to his projects. But these are mangers that have been cut out of stone. Here's another trough or manger. And then here's a picture, a larger picture, kind of a wider picture of the stable areas for those horses. And when you get out there and you walk among those stones, you can kind of, you see where the stones are lined up, and these are walls. And you get an idea that, there were rooms and there were compartments. And some of these were for storage, some of these were for people to sleep, some of these were for weapons, some of these were, they stored things the way that we do, and they wanted them to be handy and they wanted them to be taken care of, and they just had to go to greater lengths. They couldn't go down to Home Depot and buy 2x4s and sheetrock, they had to haul stones. But you know what is amazing about some of this work too is, I mean, some of this is so precise that you can't get a knife blade between it. It's that precise. And the stones are that fitted. And it's just amazing what they were able to do. But as you know, in those pictures earlier of the tell itself, I mean, you can see what a vantage point that was. You're 200 feet up in the air. You're in a fortified city. You have, 2 Kings chapter 4 talks about, the chariots, they surmise that there was probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 400 to 500 horses, depending on how many stables you think are there. But there were a lot of horses up there, a lot of chariots, and it was just a fortress that was going to be hard to take if you didn't have overwhelming numbers and a lot of food supplies to be able to wait them out. And you sit out there and you are so prepared. And Solomon was no dummy. And he goes all the way up to Dan and Gezer and Hatzor. Hatzor, the fortress, is still there too. And you know what happens is if Hatzor sees somebody coming, they immediately dispatch somebody to go to Megiddo or to the next fortified city to say, get ready, the Assyrians or the Babylonians, or later in history it would be the Romans, they're coming. And these places would then prepare, and they would prepare, and they would prepare, and they would be able to see from far off, the enemy coming. And they would be prepared. And a lot of times in the ancient world, it meant that you sat around and waited for somebody to say uncle. You can see the shape of a horse. That's one of the sculptures there that kind of gives you perspective of the size of the stables, the size of the animals, and where they were located on that piece of property. Yeah, they have a chariot with horses hooked up to it that's in a sculpture like that as well. And that is Megiddo. Questions? The ancient world is pretty interesting. And we said at the very beginning that knowing a little bit about the land brings clarity in a lot of passages. And so, when you read a passage like Revelation chapter 16, and you know nothing about Megiddo, you don't know where it's located, you don't know what importance it has militarily or politically, you don't know what advantages it brings to Israel economically because of where it's located. And then all of a sudden you see, there were a lot of battles that were fought there for Israel. There were a lot of international battles that were fought there. And when you begin to see that Megiddo is more than just a name on the page, but it represents something symbolically in the area of politics and economics and military and all of these kinds of things. And then you go to a place like Revelation chapter 16 and you realize that what you're reading is apocalyptic literature. It's not straight up historical or even straight up prophetic material where it's one-to-one correlation, and you realize that, okay, what I'm reading here is something that is symbolic. Well, what is the symbolism of Megiddo? Megiddo is the place where God's people, where that plain out there in front of the tell of Megiddo is the place where the battles of God were being fought and where God's people were victorious. And it was a place where God's judgments were made. And you take that symbolic meaning of Megiddo, from the history, the literal history of it, and apply it to a book that is symbolic, then all of a sudden Armageddon is not this battle at the end of the ages that you're looking for between the Antichrist and Jesus, or whatever flavor of theology that you have that looks at the end times that way. But you see it more as, and if you think about it too, I mean, you're the early church, you're about to get squashed by Rome. What does that battle, 2,000 or more years down the road have to do with what you're going through right now? That's not very encouraging. Basically what it's saying is that God can't take care of you now, but somewhere down the road, You know, the message is that Rome has a shelf life. You know, that this is no different from any other kingdom, any other. I mean, Psalm 2, the nations rise up, the kings of the land rise up against the Lord's anointed. You know, that is historical fact. People in charge will raise themselves up against the God who is in charge. And these people reading the book were encouraged to know that this is not the end. That, you know, the word Caesar means king. Who is really Caesar? The guy that's sitting on that throne in Rome, or the one that's sitting in the middle of the universe in heaven? And to know that God is not just going to defeat Rome, but is defeating Rome. And that Armageddon, you know, it's the Waterloo. You know, Rome's going to meet us Waterloo. It's going to meet us Waterloo. And to see how knowing a little bit about the geography and the history of these places help us to understand what's happening in other places of the Bible, keep us from kind of running off in some pretty dangerous directions theologically.
So the we saw Megiddo has 25 layers below it, right? When did they think that layer was created? When did that city was actually built?
Well, the buildings are going to date to the time of Solomon. Solomon became king about 970 and ruled until about 931. And so somewhere in the middle of that period of time, that 40 years that he was reigning, either as co-regent with David or was full solo king, that's when all of that was built. And, you know, the archaeologists can probably give you a little bit more of a dating based on the text and when these things were happening in 1 Kings and, you know, the Chronicles and all of that. But, yeah, we're looking probably, 950 years or so before the time of Christ. And they had that kind of technology. You know, as an engineer, your mind is going to be boggled. Yeah. All right. We will see you guys next week.